Hello everybody and welcome back for another local history story. Now you might remember last week we were round about the Sidlaw Hills for a lot of the story, round about Newtile, and we're going to stay in that part of the world for one more week because the Sidlaws is a part of the world where there is a lot of folklore and old stories connected to the places round about there. And this week I'm going to tell you the story of Sir James the Rose. This is a story that comes from an old ballad, and as there often are with songs and ballads, there's quite a lot of different versions of this story. But one of the oldest versions, it has the action set in the Sidlaw Hills round about Dundee and Auchterhouse. And as the title suggests, the hero of this story is a man named Sir James the Rose. He was a well-known knight in his day, and he had recently killed one of his old enemies in battle. So this was a victory for him, but the man he had killed had some very powerful friends. In particular, a man named Sir John the Graham. And Sir John got a band of knights together to hunt Sir James the Rose down and get their revenge. And although John had this large band of knights, James was only accompanied by his faithful servant, a man named Donald. So James made his way straight to Auchterhouse Castle. This was where he knew he would find support, because his true love, a young woman named Matilda, lived there. And James arrived in the dead of night and he crept up to Auchterhouse Castle. He didn't want to rouse the whole household because he didn't know how that might go, so he just tapped on Matilda's bedroom window. And she came and saw him there and he whispered his story and how he was now a man on the run. And Matilda told him that he would be best to maybe go into the town and find a room in the inn and check in sort of under a false name. But James told her that he would go out into the wilderness and he would find somewhere to hide. He knew a place near Dundee Crags where he could spend the night. And she promised that at dawn the very next morning she would come and find him there and they would make their escape. But as soon as James sneaked away, there was a hammering at the front door of the castle. And Matilda, being awake anyway, she went down and she was first to the door. And there stood John the Graham and his men. They knew that this was somewhere James the Rose might be heading. "Has James been by here?" John demanded. "He has killed my friend and we will have justice." And Matilda told them, well, yes, he has been here, but that was days and days ago, and he'd be well on his way up north by now. But Matilda stood and she watched the knights discussing their next move and how they would follow James. And her mind started to turn to her family's declining fortunes and the threadbare, draughty halls of the castle. And just before John the Graham was about to turn and leave, she called after them, "I can help you find James if you give me a good reward." And Sir John Graham swung his horse round immediately. "If we find him, his purse and all the money in it is yours." So Matilda said, well, go to Dundee Crags, try the bank just above the mill there. And the riders thundered off into the night. Before long, they arrived at Dundee Crags and they saw James sleeping there on the ground and his servant Donald was still with him. They were just wrapped up in their plaids, lying on the ground. And one of the men, he drew his sword and he would have just beheaded James there in his sleep, but John the Graham stopped him. He said, "I will not have it said that I killed a sleeping man." So they formed a circle around James and they waited for him and Donald to awake. But they were not as honourable as all that, because before James awoke they took his sword from him. So as soon as he opened his eyes and he saw that he was surrounded, James the Rose reached for his sword, but it was gone. "At least give me the decency of a fair fight," he said to John. "You showed no mercy to my friend, and we will show you none now." James knew that this was the end for him. So he reached into his plaid and he took his purse of gold and he handed it to Donald. And he said, "You have been a faithful friend to me. There's only one task left for you now, and that is to see that my body gets home and buried. And that will be some payment to you for that." And Donald took the purse and he watched with tears in his eyes as John Graham and his men slew his master. And after that, John Graham, he cut James's heart from his chest and he carried it back to Auchterhouse Castle, where he presented it to Matilda. "We could not get his purse," John said, "but you may have his heart." And when she saw this heart, Matilda, of course, realised the full force of what she'd done and how badly she had betrayed James. And she sobbed and wandered off from the castle towards the crags of Dundee, and she was never seen again. So that is the end of one version of the ballad. And there is another version as well that was going around in the 19th century. And this is one where Matilda does remain faithful to James. She does not have the change of heart and she doesn't tell John the Graham where to find him. But John and his men do come across James hiding anyway. And they come back to Auchterhouse Castle and they have a fight there. And James is still defeated and Matilda kills herself on the same sword out of grief. And there's a tradition that goes with this version of the ballad, which says that there's a hawthorn tree still growing in the grounds of Auchterhouse Castle that marks the spot where James and Matilda both died. So even when you get two endings in one of these stories, they're both kind of horrible ones, unfortunately. But that is the story of James the Rose and Matilda at Auchterhouse. And we will be back in Dundee City proper for next week's story. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.